this is Susan Beyer, and you are at Fun with Research. Thanks for joining me today. Today I want to talk about research studies over time. These might be called longitudinal studies, tracking studies, omnibus studies may all be terms that you hear for these. And they're really simply an effort to monitor, as time goes by, certain characteristics of an audience. So for example, as agency folks, you might need to be monitoring brand awareness or awareness of a key competitor. You might be tracking attitudes over time with respect to a particular category, a particular company, a particular type of product, something like that. So those are all examples of longitudinal or time-based studies. A couple things that you need to think about with respect to these. These studies are usually intended to accurately represent what's happening in an audience at any particular time. So you want to make sure, as you do with any of the research that you do, that your sample is representative of the audience that you're talking about. So for example, that means you wanted to be monitoring for things like demographic distribution. If you're tracking opinion in a state or a region, you want to make sure that your sample aligns with, for example, census data breakdowns for age and income, gender, those kinds of things. You also want to make sure that your sample is large enough to be representative. And we've talked about this on another video in this series. But you need to make sure that you're not just sort of polling 10 people, because the likelihood that they will accurately represent the larger population is not very good. So you want to make sure your group is representative. You want to make sure that the sample size is sufficient. You also want to make sure that your group stays consistent over time. Now, there are a couple of different ways to do this. One is you just survey the same people over and over and over again, so that your sample remains the same over time. That can be very difficult to pull off, especially with larger studies where you need a large sample, because people tend to drop off over time, etc. So what most folks do is make sure that their sample is consistent over time. So matches the same sort of demographic characteristics, regionality, those kinds of things, so you don't sort of accidentally get wildly different samples between, June and November. So you want to make sure that you have a consistent sample if you're going to be using this to sort of extrapolate how behaviors or characteristics or opinions are moving over time in an audience. The other thing that's very important to do in longitudinal data and studies is to note factors outside of the study that could be having an effect. So one, very sort of pertinent example right now is the impact of the coronavirus pandemic, the impact of economic factors like a recession that could be affecting things happening in the study. So if you're doing a longitudinal study about likelihood to go out to eat, you're definitely going to want to note in your analysis and in your results for your readers, for your consumers of your data, when something like the pandemic hit. You certainly want to take into account there might be differences regionally in sort of the growth of the pandemic, the number of people who were ill, lockdown orders, those kinds of things, because you want your audience to be able to sort of look at the data and say, okay, well, it makes sense that we had a spike there because this also was happening at the same time. So you don't need to necessarily throw the baby out with the bathwater in the event of something like that. In fact, there's good reason to assess how events like that are impacting attitudes, characteristics, those kinds of things, willingness to shop, etc., in a time like this. And if you have set up a longitudinal study and have been doing it for some period of time, you have a baseline expectation of where things might go based on where they've been, and it's very interesting and helpful sometimes to see when there are diversions from that expectation and to take note of those. So longitudinal studies, tracking studies, omnibus studies where there's a sort of ongoing study and you get to add a certain number of questions to it for a fee, can all be valuable, but make sure they're set up properly, make sure the audience is representative of the larger population that you're trying to see, and make sure that you're being aware of and calling out factors that could affect things. If you have any questions, let me know. Certainly go to funwithresearch.com if you want some more resources. I appreciate you being here with us every week. We'll see you next Friday. Bye.